Yeah. Okay. Very good. Okay. So, um, all right, everyone. Okay, I think we can get started. So, I'm the Dr. Jonathan Rosenberg. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the moderator for this session of our ongoing seminar series run by the Social Sciences Department and managed by my colleague, Dr. Hao Huang, called Great Problems, Great Minds. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Natalie Boodram. Dr. Boodram is a senior technical officer at the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, known by the acronym CANARI. A few words about CANARI before I introduce Dr. Boodram herself. CANARI is probably one of the most prominent and respected non-governmental organizations working on environmental issues in the Caribbean region. And among the really distinguishing characteristics of the work that CANARI does is they've really been innovators and worked for a long time from the perspective of the need to take a very inclusive approach by bringing local stakeholders into consultations related to the making of the design of the development and the implementation of policies and programs aimed at environmental sustainability. In other words, getting the people on the ground who are most affected and will have a great deal of traditional and local knowledge to share to understand what the problems are and how to address them. The project that actually I played a very small part in that Dr. Boodram managed on behalf of CANARI that she's going to be speaking about today was a national ecosystem assessment for the island of Grenada. Dr. Boodram herself is an ecologist specializing in forest, river, and riparian ecology. She's worked extensively both with CANARI and at previous affiliation with other regional organizations on issues and projects related to climate resilience, integrated water resource management, environmental health, and environmental education, among other things. And she brings to her work at CANARI a cross-cutting experience in natural resource policy, capacity building, and knowledge exchange, as I've kind of already alluded to. I should also add that based on her work on the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment, she also brings to her work extraordinary people management skills. I mean, this was a massive project involving dozens of authors. I really can't, you really can't underestimate the kind of work that Natalie did in that regard. Dozens of authors, research assistants, reviewers, editors, both external and internal, graphic designers, multiple training sessions and workshops and public consultations, all of this through the pandemic, and most of it done remotely. And somehow we managed finally, just a few months ago, to present to the government of Grenada a finished product that we very much hope they will value as much as it deserves to be valued. So with all of that in mind, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Dr. Boodram.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Can you all confirm that you all are hearing me? I am actually at work and my bandwidth is supposed to be very good, but you all are freezing, I'm freezing. I may need to try to hotspot off of my phone. But let's see how it goes. I'm not sure what's going on. It must be an issue with the network provider. Okay. Yeah, but we'll see.
Right now, I'm hearing you very well. The video freezes occasionally, but the sound is good.
Okay. Okay, so hopefully I can share my slides and those will be able to scroll quite easily. Well, first to correct Jonathan, he did not play a very small role in the Grenada NEA. He was one of our coordinating lead authors for chapter 1, and he is probably one of the people who gave me the least trouble. I mean, honestly, he's right. We did have a lot of personalities and issues, but Jonathan was not one of them, thankfully. So for that reason, I agreed to do this webinar. He was one of the nice ones, but not a problem at all. But it was a wonderful project to be on and to meet so many people. It was a lot of researchers from Caribbean universities, but Jonathan, for instance, from the US, we had researchers from Japan and other countries joining as well. We actually had close to 100 authors on that project. So it was a really fantastic networking opportunity. I wish we had opportunities to network more, but good connections were made. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen. And let's hope it works out. Okay, how are we doing? Everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Yes, no? Okay, all right, great. Okay, 1 second. So I am here to talk about the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment, which is a 500-page document plus, 500+ page document that Jonathan can share with you. It's online on our website. But taking a step back, I'm not just talking about the National Ecosystem Assessment. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about Caribbean science policy interfaces, talk a little bit about what environmental policy formulation looks like in the Caribbean. And then I'm trying to bring it back to the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment and how we try to adapt the process to be more useful for both environmental policy and then to be more useful for environmental action and positive environmental change, both behavior change, perhaps ecosystem change if we're lucky as well. As Jonathan would have mentioned, I am from the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute. And as he said, we are one of the better known environmental organizations in the region. And we are particularly well known for our participatory approaches to natural resources management. So exactly what Jonathan says, we are often pulled in by governments, international agencies to do policy work and other projects where they want to ensure that there is widespread consultation and the incorporations of as many views and perspectives, especially those of civil society, rural groups, women, persons, minority groups, etc. So we do a lot of work in that regard, especially as it pertains to policy formulation. So from 2019 to 2023, we did do this national ecosystem assessment. And Jonathan mentioned that he has been talking to you all about what these assessments look like and what kind of data they collect, etc. And I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But I will, of course, say that national ecosystem assessments, what they do is collate and synthesize current knowledge on the status, trends, and threats to biodiversity and ecosystem services in target countries. The idea is we pull together all of this information, but not just information on the ecosystems themselves. We try very, very hard to capture value in terms of economic value, for example, the amount of money that a mangrove ecosystem can save a government in terms of, for example, coastal protection. So within the national ecosystem assessments, we have facts and figures that can literally point to the economic value of certain ecosystems at certain sites. And that is a key part of it too. But we also spent a lot of time talking about the social and intrinsic value of these ecosystems for culture, for recreation, for health, all of those reasons. But what we are trying to do with the collation of all of that information is to make sure that that information is available for use in national and local level decision-making, including policy formulation. So decision-making in terms of development projects, for example, should I put that marina in that mangrove when that mangrove provides so much to us in terms of coastal protection? Hopefully by showcasing the actual monetary value that that mangrove provides towards coastal protection, we can convince a developer or convince the planning unit that no, let's not put that there, let's put it somewhere else. Also in terms of using that information for when they actually do develop national policies on any topic from forestry to coastal protection to climate resilience and so forth. So as I said, we are talking about the processes and outputs of the NEA, but what I will also spend some time is trying to illustrate how we're trying to not go the traditional routes of getting the information out there and not go the traditional routes of using that information for positive change. We are trying to show how we are using our participatory approaches to help with advocacy, to help with environmental communication, so that somebody who is passionate about a particular ecosystem or a particular resource has the available tools to then go to a planning ministry or to a developer or to a community meeting armed with the information to be able to argue effectively against or for a particular course of action. Okay, and we are, of course, talking about the Caribbean and Grenada. And for those of you who may not be as familiar with that region, Grenada, well, I can't point, wait, hold on. Yeah, I am in, oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't in presentation mode. Are you all still hearing me? I'm very worried that,
Yeah,
that my internet drops out. Yeah,
I'm
I'm
hearing
good?
you very well. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, for those of you who aren't as familiar with the Caribbean region, Grenada is one of the islands to the south of the Caribbean. I'm actually based in Trinidad and Tobago, but we did this project in Grenada because as a regional organization, we do work throughout the Caribbean. And generally, when you hear me refer to the Caribbean within my other slides, we are talking about the countries that are part of two what we call regional bodies. So for example, how the European countries have the European Union, there are two analogous organizations. One is called the Caribbean Community and a smaller group of islands called the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. So basically it's the islands from Trinidad and Tobago go up the chain on the right-hand side, all the way to Haiti, Jamaica, the Bahamas, but we don't, for example, include Puerto Rico or the Dominican Republic. It's mostly the English-speaking islands that I'm referring to, including Belize on the other side. So when I'm talking about the Caribbean, these are the islands I am mostly referring to. Yeah, anyway, continuing. So I am trying to talk a little bit, as I said, about the Caribbean environmental policy landscape and how we have adapted the NEA to sort of the process of the NEA to try to address some of the challenges of policy formulation and implementation in the Caribbean. And the landscape is through my lens and my experiences. So of course, there would be other perspectives, but these have been my general experiences as it pertains to the processes and challenges. And as I have said, apparently I've said it several times now, that we are trying to show how we've modified the NEA to actually suit these challenges and so forth. One of the key points with the NEA is that it's important to use advocacy and scientific information to inform policy. So we've already generated a lot of information within the main NEA document, but we are trying to equip civil society with the tools to be able to push that information forward to both develop policies and also advocate for action. And I slipped in a little point here. I know most of you all are political scientists, but one of my pet peeves are natural scientists who say that it's difficult to influence policy. And I am not so familiar with the US policy environment, but as I keep lamenting whenever I meet a scientist who makes that point of view, is that a large part of influencing policy is showing up at policy meetings. So anytime a policy is formulated in the Caribbean, there will be many consultations, there will be many interviews, there will be many opportunities to comment on draft documents. It is a very big part and parcel of policy formulation. I understand in some other regions, it's not as widely available, but in the Caribbean, if you show up and you interject something and you make your point, whoever is facilitating that process is mandated to take your point of view, and if not adapted, include it directly, to adapt it in some form or fashion. So that's my little plug that I always make when I'm speaking to natural scientists, that you all have no right to complain about not being able to inform policy if you do not show up to the meetings, if you do not comment on the documents and so forth. All right, and when I'm talking about environmental policy, I mean, you all would know a definition better than I do, but what I am referring to within the Caribbean includes both national and regional frameworks. And it's not only the actual policy documents, for example, the climate policy of Grenada or the forest policy of Grenada, but we also have a lot of supporting documentation that fits into the policy frameworks. So if there's a policy being developed, there's often supplementary material, for example, strategies, a roadmap, a plan, and all of these ultimately are supposed to also then inform legislation and then activities under local, national, regional projects, programs, and work plans. One of my frustrations within the Caribbean is that oftentimes we develop a policy, let's say a climate policy for a particular country. There's a lot of funding that goes into a lot of what I consider unnecessary paperwork. So again, a lot of this is my perspectives of my challenges. Somebody would have a different point of view. But one of my frustrations with policy is that there are too many intermediate pieces of paper. You have a policy, yes, you may want to develop that a little bit more to be a bit more specific in terms of a strategy, but then somebody would say, oh, we need a roadmap, and then, oh, we need a plan. And then you never really get to the actual stage where you do an activity informed by that policy, or you don't change something, or you don't fix something, or you don't plan something as per that policy. So I find that is one of the challenges we have in the region, that there are too many intermediate pieces of paper. You know, have one or two, but then get to the action point. So again, how does environmental policy, shape up, or how does it happen in the Caribbean? So the way it normally starts would be a particular ministry or a particular agency, let's say, for example, in Grenada, would flag that there are some challenging issues or some new issues around a particular topic. So I know, for instance, there is a coastal policy currently in development in Grenada, which thankfully we have a tight link to, because one of the main advocates for the Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment and one of the coordinating lead authors is actually the head of the Environment Division. So one of the good things with the NEA is the fact that we have this direct link to the relevant technical people who actually input into the design of the NEA so that they would have the information available when they are ready to craft specific policies. And for the Grenada NEA, it was not only needs expressed by government. Our very first consultation for the design of the NEA was with civil society. What kind of information do they need? What kind of information do they need to inform what kind of policies? One of the interesting things that came out of the Grenada NEA, which is different from many other national ecosystem assessments, is that there was a strong emphasis on genetic resources. So at both the government level and at the civil society level, the people are very interested in protecting their rights as it pertains to their genetic resources. So we have an entire chapter flagged around genetic resources and their value and what needs to be protected. So policy formulation, I mean, I digressed into how the NEA feeds into it. But let's say, for example, there are new issues emerging around climate resilience, for instance. The particular agency would signal, okay, we need to develop or update a particular policy. Very rarely do you find the actual ministries or agencies that flag this need having the resources to be able to do the policy themselves. And it's not that they don't have the technical capacity. Literally, for example, in the case of Grenada, our environment division, it's the same person I mentioned, the head of the environment division, and perhaps 2 junior members of staff trying to do 1,000,001 things. So they often they have the expertise, but they do not have the manpower/person power to be able to execute and develop the relevant policies. So what often happens is that there would be in tandem development of projects through ODA, Official Development Assistance. Most of the environmental projects in the Caribbean are funded through GEF, Global Environment Facility Funds, European Union funds, There's a lot of funding in the Caribbean through the German government, but there's very rarely significant inputs from national budgets. I wasn't able to find some figures from a previous report I had done, but yes, most of the funding in the Caribbean for both policy formulation, environmental policy formulation, and environmental project formulation and execution is through external funding, right? So normally what would happen when these projects are being developed, perhaps by the same government agencies or by a related regional agency, there would be consultation and what are the policy needs. Many, if not all, of these environmental projects have a policy component. So they would do a round of consultations. Grenada, what policies are you all interested in developing, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's a budget line. And then whoever is executing the project would often hire a consultant who would work alongside that particular national agency to develop the particular policy identified. Again, it's not a lack of expertise, it's a lack of time and human resources to be able to do that. So you will hear me flag words like CARICOM, OECS that I mentioned already, Global Water Partnership, FAO, PAHO. For many of these, I have worked on policies, strategies, frameworks to support both national and regional interventions. Yeah, and I will go into them in another slide a little bit more. What often happens as well, because many of these islands are lacking in human resource and funding, to shorten the process, there have often been what are called model policies. So through the same regional project, they would develop a model water policy, for instance. So then when it comes time for the national entities to implement or design a water policy, they usually start with this model policy and then adapt it a little bit here and there for their national context. So how do these policies, what is the process like on the ground? So as I said, Canary in particular, and some of my previous jobs, we get called upon to enact these policies. Usually it's a case of starting with desk review, then a lot of consultations, national consultations, consultations with specialist groups, consultations with the actual line ministry or the line agency, lots and lots of drafts, which are publicized regionally, which are publicized on the internet, which sometimes we drive through towns and countries with a speaker, you know, inviting people to meetings. And it's just a very iterative process where we go through many different stages of review, iterative stages, and then we develop the final draft, which when finalized, would have to be submitted to cabinet for adoption. Yeah. I have a number of policies that have been sitting on a shelf and have not reached cabinet as yet. Yeah. There might be a change in government. There might be a lack of political will. It might be that the persons who tried to get the policy done did not advocate successfully enough for it to go to Parliament and be adopted. And I'm afraid there's a lot of that in the Caribbean. I will show some examples where one in particular that's hurtful for me is the Grenada forest policy, which I spent a lot of time on, and which I might still try to make some attempts through post-Grenada NEA work to see if we can actually push it through. But policy, and I think I have this on one of my later slides, policies are just step one, yeah? Even if you adopt a policy, as I said before, there's often a lot more paperwork before we actually get to actions on the ground. And even actions on the ground, it's the same external funding that's often being used, where you write up a project, you reference a policy, whether it's a national policy or regional policy, as a justification for the activities on the ground, and then you implement. But many policies, even if they are adopted, aren't referenced as heavily as they should, are not publicized as they should, are not used as well as they should to inform legislation, for instance. Yeah. And then when they are implemented, it's not all doom and gloom. I know I'm being a bit doom and gloom, but these are the challenges. These are the challenges, and these are the circumstances we have to work around. And the way Canary tries to work around all of these challenges towards positive environmental action is through our participatory approaches. It's through our starting at the ground level or at the grassroots level, ensuring that we have a groundswell, ensuring people are equipped with the information and with the tools to advocate and push and work towards their particular goal. I'm not saying it's 100% successful. It is one methodology towards positive environmental change, but it is the approach we tend to focus on the most. All right, so to give some examples of some of the points that I just made. So these are policies that I've worked on throughout my career. The first two are actually from previous jobs. So I worked on the Dominica water policy, and that was when I worked for one of the CARICOM agencies. Remember, CARICOM is one of the intergovernmental bodies like the EU in the Caribbean. And we had developed a JEF project on integrating water and coastal area management, and it included a policy component. And I was a project manager for a particular component under which we supported the development of the Dominica water policy. I actually cannot remember the status of that one, whether it was implemented or not. I think it took a while, but not implemented, adopted. I think it took a while, but it did eventually get adopted. I was project manager, and I would have hired some consultants that I would have worked with. And yes, we would have gone in country, done a number of consultations towards the development of that policy. Similarly, after working for CARICOM, I worked with another regional NGO that focused heavily on water resources management, and that was the Global Water Partnership. And for that one, I managed a program called a Water and Climate Development Program. And under that one, we did develop a water policy for Antigua. I'm actually not sure of that one too. I actually needed to check up on that one to see where it had reached. But you hear my uncertainty. Up till the time I finished working with Global Water Partnership, it was not adopted by the government. Yeah. And in that case, while we were a regional agency, and in a couple other cases, we would have been consultants. It's slightly different roles. It's a little more difficult for these external, even though it's regional agencies, to be pushing for something. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes pressures from international agencies can push something through. Sometimes you need that local voice a bit more. So I think the failure in those cases was that the push from within the country to get it passed was not that strong, or they did try and maybe it just was not well received. It's a difficult pathway. Yeah. Another one that was successful actually was here at Canary, when we worked a couple of years ago on a climate change policy strategy and implementation plan for St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and external funding again, that was World Bank funding. Through the OECS, I spent a lot of time on the Grenada draft forest policy. And some of the challenges with that one is a lack of participation. So that even though we spent a lot of time trying to bring everybody together, we ended up getting much more civil society participation in the development of that policy than government. So while the key government entities were there, a lot of them that were invited, people from the Ministry of Planning or people from Transport or other ministries, apart from the line ministry, they did not show up. And it's part of the human resource issue that a lot of times they don't have the time to come. Sometimes it's a lack of how would I put this? Sometimes it's a lack of prioritization, I guess. But that one was frustrating because we ended up with a very good policy. I like it very much, but it was mainly written by civil society, which isn't a bad thing, but it would have done better had we have more government input into it. But the person or the head of the agency at the time, I think, did not do that strong a job in pushing it through. So it is still sitting on a shelf. And one of the things I'm hoping, we have some follow-up projects to the Grenada NEA. I'm hoping that maybe through some of them, we can do some additional advocacy to maybe even do a little bit of updating, because it's been a good few years since 2018, but maybe to get that one through cabinet. Yeah. And then in terms of regional policies and framework, some that I've worked on included the Caribbean Community CARICOM Biodiversity Strategy, the OECS, Organization of Eastern Caribbean States Biodiversity and Ecosystems Framework, and a Climate Resilient Forest Strategy for the Caribbean. Now, the benefit of all of these, it's basically all the countries coming together and saying that this is a priority for the region. And because we have these regional policy documents, we use that as justification for funding. So in particular, for instance, right now, because of how much we pushed ecosystem valuation under the Caribbean Community Biodiversity Strategy, the GIZ, sorry, I forget what it stands for, but the German funding agency, they are actively pursuing a project on ecosystem valuation based on what was said in the CARICOM Biodiversity Strategy. So these regional documents have an extensive weight because they say, okay, it's not just only one country wants this. We want, as a group, we would like this way forward. And then people who develop the policies and are advocating for the policies use it very heavily to find funding. So for example, this year on my to-do list, I've actually ignored this Caribbean Climate Resilience Forestry Strategy last year because I was focusing on the Grenada NEA, but it's on my to-do list to sit down and start shopping this around, this entire strategy for funding, yeah? All right, so all of that to give you an idea of what Caribbean policy environment looks like. And then we come to the Grenada NEA, right? Grenada National Ecosystem Assessment. And we were invited by the government of Grenada to execute this project. And it's back to that same reputation that Canary has because of our participatory approaches and how we get everybody involved in the process and we try to address multiple needs. And the point of the NEA is to support decision-making and build capacity in support of national ecosystem assessments. And as I mentioned, a lot of the funding comes from European Union countries, both the EU in general and government of Germany. And what this project is trying to do as it pertains to policy is provide the information to support policy formulation and information for decision-making, yeah? Both in terms of what the policy should contain and also in terms of national development decisions. So the main output is the Grenada NEA report, which we launched in October last year. And you can, if you need a weapon, if someone is attacking you, it's a 500-page, very heavy document. It's very good to ward off attackers, right? But it is very detailed in providing information on the current status and threats to ecosystems in Grenada, the importance and value of these ecosystems. We spent a lot of time talking about future scenarios. If we take one development path, this is what the country would look like in 50 years. If we do it in a more environmentally friendly way, if we go as a business as usual model, what we're gonna look like in 50 years. And it is a decision support tool. And like I said, one of the good things about this document is that it addressed the needs that the main environmental, the head of the environmental agency wants. So it's a first step in the direction to ensure that the information gets into policy. We are also just finishing up a much shorter document, a 15-page document with some of the key points as it pertains to policy, which we are pushing through cabinet. So I think the cabinet note has already been done, and we need to do some follow-up to see that it gets adopted by cabinet, which then hopefully would translate to greater buy-in and implementation of activities based on the recommendations of the NEA and any policies that it supports. So the methodology did follow the traditional methodology largely set out by IPBES. And if you're familiar with the IPCC, the IPBES is basically the biodiversity equivalent. And it is a tool the main tool, that the IPBES methodology prescribes is trying to have dialogues with ministers and relevant technical staff to get the scientific information where it needs to be. We are using that route, but we are putting a lot more emphasis on the civil society angle as in making sure that the information is out there in layman terminology, in what we call a citizen's guide, so that local people can use it and advocate and put pressure on the relevant ministers and technical staff as needed, right? So we did collect a lot of data, we compiled databases, a lot of geospatial information. As I said, we had, when I did this slide, it was over 100, but we had attrition. Some people, got tired, they had other demands. So I think it was eventually a final core team of 72 authors, including 14 coordinating lead authors, of which Jonathan, Dr. Rosenberg is one, a number of lead authors, contributing authors, and fellows, and it was multidisciplinary teams. And the topics that the NEA addressed included Jonathan's chapter, which was the introductory chapter. And then we did a very elaborate chapter on the status and threats to Grenada's forest, coastal, marine, freshwater, and agricultural ecosystems. And these ecosystem types that we focused on were chosen by the stakeholders in an initial scoping exercise. Of course, we did focus on the current and projected value of all the resources within these ecosystems. There was a heavy focus on climate resilience and genetic resources. Again, these were priorities that the stakeholders identified. And then looking at opportunities, how can we maximize and amplify delivery of ecosystem services for economic and social well-being? So this actually was the main policy chapter, where we showed, using the outcomes of the different chapter, try to make recommendations in a somewhat neutral way for how policy directions should go as it pertains to these particular topics. And then we did include a chapter on scenarios and pathways to a sustainable future, right? As I said, in developing this document, we're making sure that people are aware of it, that people are inputting into it, and that in another slide that they have the outputs readily available. So numerous consultations, making sure we had any indigenous local knowledge. We did surveys, we did consultations, we designed the policy questions based on what the people wanted. We tried to make it a little bit more beneficial for them. So we did a bits of training in between, not only on the main topic, which is ecosystem valuation, but also little things like, if they want to be able to use the information, they have to be able to use it through advocacy, using simple tools, for example, videos, social media, those kinds of things. How do they go about doing those kinds of things? And we actually went and looked for additional funding, my organization, where we got funding from another project that we were working on, a global environment facility project, where we're taking all the very complicated scientific information within the main 500-page document and developing a CSO, civil society organization, Citizens Guide to the NEA. And we've actually done training with the civil society on how to communicate that information, basically how to do environmental advocacy. And we went so far as to actually develop some communication campaigns, which we're hoping to implement this year. We were supposed to do it last year, but it didn't happen. We actually pulled out relevant facts and figures and came up with a campaign. We're going to target this minister. We're going to talk about why we need to protect the mangroves. We're going to try and do some training, all of that to be able to translate the scientific information into actual action on the ground rather than sitting on a shelf. Yeah. And so, as I said, we're doing a citizens guide where we're hoping we can repackage some of the information and also give them a tool then that they can use to be able to convey the information further on, including pulling it out at any policy consultations that might be taking place and saying, look, this says so-and-so, therefore I think your policy should include this, yeah? Oh, okay, and that was it. So I feel I've been a little rambly, but hopefully I've given you all a lot to think about and maybe a lot of questions because I've been rambling in different places. So I can stop now and I can take any kind of questions that you all may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. That was that was much better organized and clear than you give yourself credit for. And I think you've given us a lot to chew on, and we will encourage questions. I would just like to correct one thing that you would not own, and that is, since we are a tech school, very few of us on this end are actually political or social scientists. And most of the students you're talking to are training in scientific and engineering fields. So your admonition is very well timed. They will hear it before they go out to pursue their professions, and have it in mind when they do.
Thanks for that correction. Sorry about that.
Sure. So now, if anyone has any questions or any comments for Dr. Boodram on anything that she covered, or anything that she implied, or if she mentioned anything that you feel needs some clarification, if you could use the hand raising function, that makes it easier for us to see who wishes. If you're not familiar with that, if you on the bottom toolbar, it says there's a reactions tab. Click on that and you'll see a hand raise button, and just click on that with any questions or comments. And if you don't have the capacity to do that, you can type in the chat, and Dr. Huang and I will monitor the chat and read out your questions or comments. And you're being awfully quiet.
I see there's Isaac.
There is
one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned that they're like for the public meetings, they're like widely announced, even with like speakers on a vehicle, you said, I think.
Yeah.
I was wondering, like, what kind of engagement you get from in those public meetings. I know in the US they're often low attendance, mostly like elderly. So.
Yeah, it's all about timing. It's all about sometimes thinking of their needs. So if, for example, we're doing a consultation in a rural community, we try to do things like have the meetings on an evening. You make sure there's a meal. Sometimes if there's problems with transport, we organize for transport to pick up people at key places. I think one of the strategies we often use, so yes, we might have a mic, we call it a PA system, a mic, a roving PA system. We might do that, but we often, when we go into a particular area, we use what we call local mobilizers. So we identify a civil society organization or a village council member or somebody like that who we actually hire to go in and talk to people and serve as the introduction to us. So it's not a bunch of strangers coming into their community talking to them. They would have heard about it and been encouraged to participate. Sometimes though, I mean, we don't pay them to attend, but we try to cover costs. So like costs of transportation is often difficult. So sometimes we would offer, for instance, transport stipends for people to come. But what we found the most effective is using local mobilizers for whatever community that we're dealing with. So it's not just us, it's somebody they know and trust. Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Next.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Boodram gave a great talk. So I'm wondering, so you list there are different ways to connect the data, and also to interview and consult the participants and also citizens. So I'm wondering what's based on your assessment, what's the most concerns from this assessment in terms of biodiversity?
Climate change, impacts of climate change. That's key. And then development as a whole. There's a lot of even though they're planning regulations and so forth, there's a lot of unapproved planning, deforestation, unsuitable development. Yeah. So that would be one, and climate change is basically the main thing everybody's talking about in the Caribbean. Yeah.
So, could you give more elaborate about this climate change in terms of local context?
Okay. So the ones that everybody would be concerned about would be rising sea levels, of course, and inundation of coastal areas. That is a concern. But water resources management is actually at the forefront as well in terms of climate change. So the Caribbean is predicted to become substantially drier with climate change. Yeah. So basically, there's a lot of discussion around water sources. Do we need to do more desalination, which nobody wants really, but it's for many countries, it's the only alternative at this point in time. But having water security and also food security under climate change is of concern. Yeah.
And which way, since you list the several ways to connect the information, so which way you think is most efficient and effective way to connect those data and information?
So it depends on what context. I mean, you want to get the local information, what people themselves are most worried about, which is where we would do the consultations with the different stakeholders. But of course, we would also be referencing all the research, all the papers, etc. So it depends on what particular angle you're going through. I mean, there are some very recent reports on climate change that universities have produced that we've referenced, that everybody is referencing. I know an issue is making sure we have information at the scale we need. So some of the climate models are at too broad a scale. So I know the climate scientists in the Caribbean often complain about that. I think the information, it might be personally, I think it's enough information that we can act on. But the information is pulled from different sources, whether it's climate models, whether it's collecting the views and the particular concerns of the people on the ground, including the changes they are seeing. You know, how are their crops being affected, in addition to whatever climate information we can get from the different universities. So it's a collaboration of the different types, yeah, to form a cohesive package.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments? Anyone, please chime in.
There's one.
Oh,
There's
okay.
one.
Celeste?
Yes, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question. I feel like with climate change, I feel like a really big concern is like the increase in like the impact of like hurricane season.
Oh, yeah. Did I not mention that? I'm so sorry. Whoops. Yes.
So I was wondering
Oh
if
my
like
gosh, I am sorry. Yes, my
Okay.
brain went to what? Yes, we're very scared about the hurricanes. I am so sorry. That should have actually been number one coming out of my mouth. I apologize, but yes, definitely disaster resilience vis-a-vis climate change is a huge, huge concern. I mean, the worst one in recent times was Hurricane Maria and what it did to Dominica. I mean, that was bad. I recently visited Barbuda last year, and that country is flattened by, I think it was Hurricane Irma. So yeah, so it is the more intense hurricanes that is of great concern. I do not know where my brain was. Thank you.
Maybe it was too obvious, but
Yeah, maybe. Let's go with that.
and actually, if I could just add something to that, particularly when we look at the Eastern Caribbean and Grenada, especially, historically speaking, it's a recent phenomenon that
Yeah.
hurricanes are so destructive and of such concern.
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
geographically positioned to be relatively a sheltered part of the Caribbean, and
Mm.
it really isn't until the early part of this century, with at least in Grenada, with Ivan and Emily, and I think in 2004 and 2005, that
Yeah.
there was a major destructive hurricane. And I know it's been many years since I've been in Dominica, and it was long before the recent hurricane, but they still talked about Hurricane David from sometime in the 1950s as the historically most destructive hurricane. And as far as really destructive hurricanes went in that region, they were talking about 50-year and 100-year storms. Now they're coming with much greater frequency and
Yes.
with more ferocity than ever.
I think it's less the frequency and more the intensity. That's the major issue at this point in time. Yeah, definitely the intensity, Category 5 hurricanes, that's definitely of concern. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So thank you, Celeste.
Good. Anyone else? Then, if you will, I'm going to switch topics a little bit, but to something that you talked about. You mentioned GEF quite frequently, and for those of you not familiar, that stands for Global Environment Facility, and it is a grant-making facility that's managed principally by the World Bank. And it's a very important source, as Dr. Boodram has said, for funding of development projects of various kinds, with an eye toward environmental management and lessening environmental impact. And it's particularly important to the Caribbean, in part because GEF gives grants rather than loans, and second, because in global terms, the amounts tend to be relatively small. So they're kind of scaled to Caribbean-sized projects. And there's been a long developing relationship between that funding agency and the OECS and Caribbean nations in general. Is there a natural preference to go to GEF as a first try for funding, or what are kind of the comparative relationships and experiences with different sources of development assistance and the environmental impacts of the projects that they will fund or not fund?
GEF is almost the go-to. I think, yeah, you're right. Because I think I'm actually not as familiar with how it's set up, but each country has what they call a star allocation, something that they're entitled to automatically from GEF. So it's a matter of how you use those funds. So it's often the first one you go to because there already is a pot of funds that should be available to you for use. Yeah. EU funds, it's also where the funding is coming from. But yes, people go to GEF first and then to EU. In terms of reporting requirements and ease of accessing the funds, not that GEF is easy, but EU tends to be a bit more difficult. And I'm saying that as in terms of us both writing up projects and also administering them. And of course, everybody is going to, right now as well, all the different climate funds. So Green Climate Fund, some countries, some entities are still trying to get accredited to the Green Climate Fund. We ourselves have a project with them. So to add to what I said, I didn't mention the different climate funds. There's the Adaptation Fund, a couple others that I'm not as familiar with. But yeah, GEF, the climate funds, and EU is a bit more difficult, I would say. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Dr. Boodram? Okay.
All right.
Seeing none, I'll take the opportunity. We have a few minutes left to ask one more. And this is something that actually I had sort of puzzled with to a certain extent through the whole NEA process. And that's the use of the ecosystem services approach and model. It's not uncontroversial, at least in scholarly circles, but but you can make some strong practical arguments for
Yes.
for using it, especially for the intentions of this sort of study. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Insofar as it does give you, in many cases, a monetary value. The idea being that if you can talk to a minister and actually put a figure to something, that should influence them a bit more in terms of, because they think dollars and cents. Yeah. That, however, has its limitations. Some persons, especially some of our other authors, we have an expert, Hiro from Japan, who talks about nature's contribution to people, that in terms of the value of these services, we also have to take into account cultural, social, religious value in some cases. And in terms of making an argument, if you go to a minister and say, hey, let's protect that mangrove because it will save the country, you know, $1 million by not having to build a seawall, that's one argument. And it is a valid argument, but it might also be useful to add within that sphere of arguments. Minister, don't you remember catching crab or catching fish as a boy in that area? So both of these approaches are being used to try to frame arguments around reasons to conserve and protect resources. And as I said, the Grenada NEA was, actually, no, I never said this. The Grenada NEA is the first one for the region, and there is significant interest in doing this for other countries in an attempt to have that information available to be able to make reasonable arguments, or arguments that people would listen to, both from an economic and from a social standpoint, why we need to protect and conserve some of these resources. Or even if you don't, know what the trade-off is, know what you're losing. Yeah? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, very well, very, very directly. And of course, and there's the challenge, of course, of putting some sort of quantifiable value on those social and cultural and spiritual values.
Right. And there are different techniques. There's a lot of different survey techniques, for instance, different methodologies. I'm not an expert in them, but there are a number of well-defined techniques that people can use to come up with these figures. Yeah.
Yeah, willingness to pay.
Yeah.
Is one of the probably the most common. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Great. We're about at the end of our time. There's 2 minutes left according to my clock. So if anyone has any last words, or Dr. Boodram, if you'd like to leave us with any parting thoughts.
Just you have to be creative. You need to look for any possible opening or avenue to effect the change that you want. Yeah, the traditional methods don't work. If you can meet a minister at a party and talk to them about mangroves, go for it. You know, whatever approaches you can, whatever door you can find to open to effect your change, look for them. Pretty much that.
Thank you.
So
a beautiful piece of advice to wrap up with.
So I have one more question. Is about since considering these national ecosystems, it's usually it has rich like abundant or rich tourism resources. So it does this since just now you mentioned like climate change is the main issue, then it's the local economic development like tourism industrials or and these sectors it's
some
just
of it is
more
tourism.
a factor, or actually in grain.
Yeah, a lot of it is tourism related development. Yes.
Yeah. But they affect is the ecosystem. They have effect, or actually it's just a very small effect, impacts compared to like climate change.
No, I mean, yes, the impact. So it's ironic because the tourists come to partake of the natural resources, but there are significant environmental impacts from tourism. Apart from the actual physical infrastructure, pollution is a very big deal. A very big deal in the Caribbean is actually sewage and improperly managed sewage, often from these tourism facilities. Yeah, so they are a contributing factor, and it's not managed as well enough as it should.
Oh, so which means they do have impacts on these ecosystems.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So mainly because of just now you mentioned the lack of infrastructure, physical
Mhm.
infrastructure.
Infrastructure, pollution, yeah, they are factors.
So
Yeah.
which means if you build more infrastructure, then actually it can achieve both economic growth and conserve or preserve ecosystems at the same time is possible.
Well, there are trade-offs, huh? I mean, I think the main thing is trade-offs. Yes, you may disrupt one particular ecosystem, but preferably not the most sensitive ecosystem. You know, it's where you do it, how you do it. Yeah.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
Then in grant these study areas, how large area is sensitive areas should be protected?
Okay, I'm going to have to actually go back to the report for that. I cannot remember.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But it's kind of needs like a sensitive areas. It have kind of international standards, or it's have any environmental standards to define this is the sensitive areas to protect or prohibit to develop tourism.
Okay, so I have to be a little careful what I'm saying. There is legislation right now in some countries, including Grenada. Legislation is being ignored.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
They are registered.
Yeah. So
Registration.
some protected areas are still being impacted by development activities in spite of there being legislation, and nothing is being done about it.
Oh, so which means
Yeah.
it's registered but still developed. So which means it's
I know of one case where a civil society organization has taken the government to court because it has allowed tourism development within a protected area. So I mean, there are even cases like that. It's not all that. There are some cases like that. Yeah.
oh, okay. So then is there any like a local like ecosystem groups or this kind of advocacy groups to have some
This
voice?
is, for example, what some of the work that we do at my organization. We provide the background support for organizations. We provide information for both use by both government and civil society, but to help the communication and advocacy process. Yeah, we try to be neutral, but we make sure everybody has the information they need to help, whether you want to protest or whether you want to advocate for something or against something, you have the information available to you.
Oh, okay. So
Mhm.
which means there do have these institutions to go through the process.
We stay in the background and we provide the information, but there are strong advocacy organizations within environmental organizations that do advocacy work in many of the countries. Yeah, with some success.
Oh, okay. So which means it's not just the local groups that they are involved, also some like international.
So oftentimes some of the regional organizations get involved. So I know like in one local case involving a mangrove, like a regional bird related NGO would have gotten involved as well. So yeah, sometimes you do get the regional civil society lending weight to the local groups. It happens.
Yeah, it seems like in terms of you mentioned like international, also have like international. So because in one slide you are showing for this project actually is funded, it seems the majority is from the outside
The funding,
resources instead of local resources, which means it's like for this outside organizations or outside stakeholders, they have more participations, or actually they
so
it's
you
more
have
like
to, it
local.
depends on the individual context. Like in Grenada, sorry, my battery is dying. I'm just trying to plug in. In Grenada, for instance, in meeting with some of the ministers, we actually brought the international organization that the funding went through, a UN organization, to some of the meetings. So it's a case of gauging what you think might have the most impact. In some cases, the local voice might have the most sway. In other cases, bringing an international pressure or an international funder, you know, and showcasing a particular issue, that can also have weight as well. So yeah, it can work. Sometimes one approach works, sometimes another does.
Oh, okay. Yeah, let's actually it seems that you mentioned in your presentation. Actually, I like you mentioned that you list what approach and also what actions or implementation is adopted or implemented, or actually just have a lot of draft, but it's revision, a lot of draft revisions, but not adopted for that that module. So and then could you in terms of you said this international, sometimes is international give more voices, and sometimes is local voice more significant. So in terms of that module, which one you think it's actually more international emphasize and more is a local emphasize in terms of some is adopted but is not implemented, but some is implemented, and some actually is draft quite a few revisions but not adopted. What's these three different situations?
I'm not sure is the answer. I think the local champion is very important. Yeah. So if someone is pushing something hard enough, and is a respected technical person within a government agency and is not afraid to speak up, that can have significant weight. Yeah. There's often a lot of politics. So sometimes it might just be that. And literally it could be, you know, a change in government and something doesn't go through because it was a product under another government. But I think regardless, having a champion, a local person within the actual, whether it's the ministry or whether it's somebody within a respected civil society organization who pushes it through, I think I've seen that having the most success. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. That's certainly borne out by some of the research I've done, because I've seen cases where externally funded projects have been very effective or have failed, and the support that local activists may receive by networking with international environmental NGOs can also be very effective. But on the ground, the importance of local buy-in, authenticity, and trust on the part of those who are actually advocating for the policy change is extremely important. There's a justifiable amount of cynicism and suspicion often.
Yeah.
When someone arrives from outside with the next with the next externally funded and
Yes.
planned cure to your problems.
Yeah.
And so really having the civil society engagement and authentically and by from people who live it on a daily basis is essential, no matter how much external support there is involved.
Oh, okay.
Well said.
So which means that the local contents very important for the success of the projects.
Yeah. Okay. I had misspoken about the time. We're going to 6:15, so a few minutes. Does anyone have any other questions or comments for Dr. Boodram? See, nothing in the chat, no one raising their hands. How is there? All right. Okay. With that, I just want us all to thank Dr. Boodram for a tremendously informative and really interesting presentation. I have to admit, I learned a few things about the Grenada NEA that I wasn't fully aware of, although I was inside much of the process. And just we hope, as Dr. Boodram has said, that there's real substantive uptake on the part of the government of Grenada, and CNARI is to be commended for not leaving it at the point of just submitting it and hoping something happens and following up. So yes, if you see lots of thank you messages, well deserved in the chat. And, we really appreciate the time and effort and all the work you've put into the NEA and taking the time to present it to us.
Yeah, and just on behalf of us at CNARI, I mean, Jonathan was amazing and wonderful, and we're happy to reciprocate.
Okay.
Yeah, I also learned a lot. Thank you so much, and also thanks Jonathan, moderate. Yeah,
Okay.
I also learned a lot.
Okay. Great.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Have a good evening, and we'll see many of you next week.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.